The theme of this year's International Holocaust Memorial Day is one day. And locally, we are looking at one person's particular discovery of the impact of the Holocaust on her family. The Road Less Travelled by Jennie looks at how the Holocaust impacted on her relations. As part of our theme, we asked Jennie 3 questions, and the first is, where did your journey start?
And my journey started one day when I decided to find out who my mother was. My mother, Elizabeth Mary Leese, was born in London in 1943. It turned out that she was the only Jewish baby to have been found to have been hidden in the UK during World War II. I said to her, "Mum, I'm going to find your family for you." Because it was at that point I realised that Mum had no context to who she was, and that it had affected her and all her relationships. Shortly after this, my mum became very ill, and she died, sadly, in January 2014. I reached out to brush her coffin with my hand, and it was only when I looked back and reflected I realised I was still looking for that elusive connection.
Having heard about the origins of Jennie's journey, we went on to ask what exactly she discovered.
So one morning in March, just a couple of months after Mum had passed away, I woke up with the knowledge that I absolutely had to find her family. I needed to know why our family had been broken, why there had been so much trauma and turmoil. So I gave my children breakfast, and then I sat down with those notes that I'd taken when Mum had spoken to me just a year before, and I put them together. I realised that actually there was no leads for my grandmother. My mum had met her briefly in the early 60s. She'd traced both her parents to London. They were now separated, divorced and remarried. But because of the displacement caused by the war and their ongoing trauma, their relationships were brief, and Mum lost touch with them again. I knew my grandmother's name was Helena, but maybe that wasn't really her name. She'd told my mum that she falsified her birth certificate. She'd written the name commemorates as her maiden name. She was reportedly Jewish. Mum's stepmother had told her that. She knew her back in Poland, and she said that Mum was half Jewish, but Mum's mother, Helena, never revealed this. So looking at the notes that I had on her, I knew there was no way I would be able to trace her. So I turned my attention to my grandfather, Stanisław Lis. Mum told me that he'd been the international secretary of the ex-Polish Combatants Association, and that he was a very active member in the exiled Polish community. He'd told her he was a marked man when she met him. So I thought surely there'll be a way to trace him. So I got out the phone book and I looked up the Polish ex-combatants, the SPK. I phoned up and I was put in touch with an old lady who told me that she'd been there since the 1950s. That was my first real contact with this, with the Polish community that had arrived here after the war, and I sensed immediately there was still trauma involved. As my grandmother was fully Jewish, my mother was also Jewish, and so was myself and my siblings, my children. I had no idea at the time what impact that was going to have on my family, but also on my life. It actually changed everything. It engaged me with a community that I knew very little about. I began to read about the Holocaust, and I learned that my grandmother had lost many members of her family, including her own brother, in the Holocaust. Through discovering where my grandmother died, I was able to trace her will. and I found out that she left everything to her nephew in America. So I'd found him. I phoned somebody in America and asked them if they could trace his records and see if he was still living. Very sadly, he died. His name was James Rosotsky. I learned that James had rescued a small boy from the Warsaw Ghetto. He and his mother were living in Warsaw in 1943. And he discovered this little boy, about 7 years old, living on the streets of Warsaw, living in his street, in a doorway, starving and in rags. So James took him home, not realizing he was Jewish himself. They hid Moshe for a number of months before they were betrayed to the Gestapo, and James ended up in Mauthausen concentration camp. It was really, I don't even know how to say how I felt when I discovered this information. I discovered other relatives as well. My family had been scattered all over the world. I matched in DNA with a cousin in San Francisco. He was his grandfather and my mother's grandfather were brothers. His name was Alan Rothenberg, and Alan sent me lots of photographs and information about the family. His father had escaped from Vienna during the war. It was through Alan that I made contact with Holocaust survivors in London that had a connection with our family. I found family all over the world, in Argentina, in America, in Poland, in Israel. The Jewish people were scattered to the ends of the earth. And I wondered, as I pondered this, were they safe? What had happened to their descendants? Are their descendants safe today? I had assumed, until I found my family, that they were safe. I mean, the magnitude of the Holocaust is incomprehensible. The more I learn about it, the less I understand. I first attended the synagogue in 2015, which was really quite a powerful moment, sitting there thinking that my grandmother had also done this many times in her past. I was asked to photograph the visit of the chief rabbi to Aberdeen, which was a great honour. I also got to know some of the members of the congregation, including Debbie Taylor. Debbie showed me some Jewish candlesticks known as menorahs that had been handed to her by somebody whose mother had assisted Jews in Holland during World War II and received these as a thank you, or maybe because they wanted them to be hidden too.
And lastly, we asked Jennie, having discovered all that she has, what implications does she believe it has for our current work and for future generations?
I've asked myself many times, as I'm sure most of us do, what I would have done had I been alive in World War II. Where would I have stood in history? Would I have had the courage to make sacrifices, maybe to hide Jewish people? What would my response have been? Of course, I can never answer this question. The time has gone. But what I do know is that I can be responsible in my own generation to speak up for Jewish people and for others who are marginalised and treated badly. I think that's the most important question that we have to ask ourselves. How can we be kind to others? How can we turn things around? My relationship with my mum, which was so difficult, has been changed, even though posthumously by my research and by the things that I've discovered. Mum always just wanted to belong. She wanted an identity. And her loss of that, as a direct result of the displacement and the trauma caused by World War II, impacted her life and the life of all her children. Through finding my family again, my children will never have that question mark. They know where they come from. They all have a very strong Scottish identity, but they know that they also are the descendants of really courageous people that had to flee their country. When it comes to being a refugee, I think about my grandfather and those words on his grave. He never lived to see again his beloved country. And I think of my grandmother and her family scattered all over the world. She never saw her sister again when she moved to America in 1951. Her family was completely broken. It falls to us and our children to remember and to stand up to all kinds of anti-Semitism, hatred and discrimination. I have learned so much through the connection I found. It has been a journey of healing in so many ways, despite the tragedy which unfolded in my past. It would not be an exaggeration to say it has changed my life. Restoration and rebuilding is always intentional, and I've been able to finally understand my mum. Beyond that personal relationship, I have discovered that sometimes seeking or finding a connection changes our perceptions and opens our hearts to others in ways we could not have dreamed. Let us not forget, we all have a connection to others through our own humanity. The impact of war and displacement can be seen through following generations. Hundreds of years old communities being uprooted and displaced leads to a loss of family, history, connection and identity that leaves a gaping hole in the lives of those affected. Simone Weil wrote during World War II, to be rooted is the most important and least recognised need of the human soul. The devastation in our family was a direct result of the devastation of war. My children now have a sense of their identity. They see themselves as very Scottish, but they also know and understand the sacrifices of the generations before them, where they came from. They have more context to their lives. One of my daughters has visited Auschwitz, and I hope that as they grow and mature and continue on in life, that they continue to carry the torch, to stand up for others, and to ask themselves, as we all must, what must I do in my own generation?
Having heard that intensely moving and very personal story from Jennie, we realise that there are implications for all of us in our work today. We have to make sure that we have a society and a city where we nurture all of us and bring everyone together so that we can have a welcoming and a caring society that avoids having even the roots of what we heard about from Jennie today. Thanks all of you for taking part in this, and I hope that you will enjoy the events and appreciate their importance for us in the future. Thank you very much.